I received a birthday card from my own daughter. No wishes. No love. Just a few printed lines suggesting I move into a premium care facility to stop being a burden. A week later, I discovered she forged my signature and sold the home my husband and I built with our bare hands. But I didn't cry. I invited her to a family dinner, then exposed everything in front of them all. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to never miss a film that grips you from the very first breath. Of all the birthdays in Teresa Lane's life, her 74th arrived with the kind of silence that scraped at the edges of her dignity. The kind of silence you don't hear at first, but feel like cold air creeping into a room with sealed windows. It was the first birthday in 52 years she hadn't received a phone call before noon. No breakfast tray, no favorite lemon tart, no voice singing happy birthday off-key from her only daughter. Just silence and a mail slot that clicked open and shut like a mouth that didn't know what to say. Her apartment sat on the 5th floor of a walk-up in Chicago's near North Side, once a modest fashion studio now retrofitted into living quarters, with wide windows, whitewashed brick, and a dusty easel that hadn't held a canvas in nearly 4 years. The air smelled faintly of lavender and paint. Her wheelchair positioned near the only window that caught real sun faced west, out toward a city she used to stride through in stilettos and satin scarves. She hadn't always been here, but here she was. At 10:14 a.m. the envelope arrived. It was white, too white, machine white, the kind that looked like it came from a printing service, not a person. No handwriting. The address label was typed in Times New Roman, centered precisely. And there above her name were the cold italicized letters, "To the best mom in the world." She stared at the envelope for a full minute before reaching for the letter opener. Her hands thinner now than they had ever been trembled slightly, not from emotion, not yet, but from a stubborn body that hadn't obeyed since the accident. With effort, she sliced the envelope open and slid the card out. It was a birthday card, glossy, mass-produced. On the front, a cartoonish bouquet of daisies exploding from a cracked teacup. Inside, nothing. No message, no ink. Just a pre-printed rhyme that made her skin crawl, wishing you comfort, care, and peace today and every day ahead. Tucked into the crease was a folded note printed on the same sterile cardstock. It wasn't long. "Mom, Rachel and I think it's time we start considering senior care options. There's a place in Oakview that's private, high-end, and perfect for your needs. It would really relieve a lot of pressure on us. We love you and want what's best. Rachel." Teresa didn't blink. Not right away. She simply held the card, her thumb pressed against the edge, like she was waiting for it to cut her. She'd been expecting something: flowers, a call, maybe brunch if Rachel could find the time. Not this. Not exile disguised as concern. She closed the card carefully, as though it were fragile. It wasn't. It was hard-edged and empty. With deliberate slowness, she wheeled herself toward the bookshelf, passing the framed photograph of her husband, Robert Lane. Taken in Rome, 1982. He was laughing, holding a gelato in one hand and her hand in the other. She paused briefly to touch the frame, her fingers brushing over the glass like tracing an old scar. Robert had been gone 17 years. She opened the second drawer of the narrow antique dresser in the corner, the one he had refinished with her in the summer of 1979. The inside still smelled faintly of cedar. Inside were old letters tied in faded silk ribbon, her wedding ring, and a tiny sketchbook she hadn't opened in years. She slid the card into the drawer. She didn't crumple it, didn't tear it. Just placed it carefully, like you might place a bone back into a wound and pretend the body will knit around it. She closed the drawer. Across the room the light shifted. The sun had reached the point where it struck the mirror above the fireplace, casting a fractured beam onto the ceiling. The ceiling she had stared at during recovery. The ceiling that had once been her battlefield during the long war of rehabilitation after the fall. Teresa turned the chair slowly. Her gaze scanned the apartment, each object imbued with decades of intention. The tapestry from Morocco, the sewing machine she'd inherited from her mother, the crystal ashtray Robert had insisted on keeping even after they both quit smoking. Her eyes landed on the easel. Dust had gathered thick on its crossbar. It looked like a relic from a life she'd quietly buried. She pressed her palms together in her lap. Her skin was dry, liver-spotted. But her hands, those same hands that once shaped silk into lines worthy of Paris, still carried knowledge. Memory. She closed her eyes. Rachel had called 3 days ago, briefly, distractedly. She mentioned workload, the twins' piano lessons, some new promotion she hadn't earned but received anyway. And then, just before hanging up, "Oh, your birthday's this week, isn't it?" As if it were an afterthought. As if the day she gave life to Rachel had somehow slipped the radar. Teresa opened her eyes again slowly. No, she wasn't angry. She wasn't shocked. Rachel had been drifting for years, too busy, too tired, too occupied by the noise of her own curated life. But this card, this perfectly printed betrayal, was something else. Not just neglect, not just distance. This was a polite execution, wrapped in white cardstock. For a long time, Teresa did nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply sat in the light, letting it crawl across her shoulders, warm and dispassionate. She had lived long enough to know that pain doesn't always show up screaming. Sometimes it arrives in neat envelopes. She reached for the small leather notebook on the side table. It was worn smooth with time. The pages inside were filled with quotes, scraps, ideas for designs that never got made. She turned to the back and began writing. Not a poem, not a memory, just one sentence. "Today my daughter stopped seeing me as a person." Then she shut the book. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room like background noise in a film where the main character has just realized the world she knew no longer exists. Teresa turned back to the window. Outside, the wind was moving the trees with quiet insistence. Chicago was still moving. Cars passed. Dogs barked. Life hummed along uncaring. She pressed her hand against the glass, felt the coolness. And for the first time in months, she thought not of what was being taken from her, but of what she might still take back. The card had not broken her. It had woken her. And this year, on her 74th birthday, she wasn't blowing out candles. She was lighting a fuse. Under the fluorescent wash of her kitchen ceiling light, Teresa Lane picked up the phone. Her hands trembled slightly, not with age this time, but intent. Purpose. Rage sharpened into stillness. She had been many things in her life, designer, widow, mother. But tonight at 7:14 p.m., she was something else entirely. A strategist. She dialed the number from memory. It hadn't changed in decades. It belonged to the only man who had ever told her with absolute conviction that her intelligence was her most dangerous asset. It rang once, then again, and then Michael Heller. The voice answered, crisp, measured, still with that slight Boston rasp he never lost no matter how many years he'd lived in Chicago. "Michael, it's Teresa Lane." A pause, the kind that comes from a man sitting up straighter in his chair. "Well, well," he said, voice softening. "Teresa, my God, it's been, 7 years since Robert's memorial?" "8, she said, almost to the day. Time's got a cruel sense of humor. He cleared his throat. "To what do I owe this very unexpected pleasure?" "I need to see you," she said, "soon, in private." "Are we talking coffee or contract?" She didn't blink. Something in between. "But not here. I don't want to be overheard." That alone told Michael all he needed. He offered to meet at his office, but she declined. Too formal, too traceable. They settled instead on a quiet corner booth at the Velvet Bean, a tucked-away cafe just off Lincoln Park, where the waiters whispered and the walls held secrets. The next morning, Michael was already waiting when Maria Teresa's part-time caregiver helped wheel her through the narrow door of the cafe. His suit was dark gray, tailored, no tie, just enough silk at the collar to remind the room that once long ago this man had cut deals in Manhattan boardrooms. "Still the best-dressed man in any place with mismatched mugs," Teresa said as she approached. Michael stood. "And you still able to weaponize sarcasm before noon? Good to see you, Terry." He leaned down and kissed her cheek gently, but not delicately. Teresa didn't do delicate. They sat. For a moment, silence hung between them. two lives brushing up against a past they'd both tried to store away neatly, like sweaters in spring. Then Teresa reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. Not the birthday card, the bank statement, folded, worn at the creases. "I've been receiving quarterly statements that don't line up," she said. "Rachel assured me it's just the market fluctuations, but something doesn't feel right." Michael took the papers. He scanned the numbers quickly, pulling a small notepad from his inner pocket. "You have online access?" he asked. "No." Rachel set up the digital side, said she'd handle everything to take the burden off me. Michael's pen stopped moving. "And you signed off on that?" "After the stroke, I signed a limited power of attorney only for medical and immediate financial management. At least that's what I was told." Michael's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. You'd be amazed how many people don't read the fine print when their own daughters hand them the pen. "I wasn't sick, Michael," she said. "I was recovering." "I know," he said quietly. "I know you." He tapped the envelope twice, the way he always had when he was thinking. Then he tucked it into his briefcase. "Give me 72 hours. I'll pull everything I can. If something's wrong, I'll find it." Teresa nodded. "I know you will." 2 days later, the call came at 9:47 p.m. Michael's voice was different this time, tighter. "Are you sitting down?" Teresa snorted. "That's all I do these days." "There's a contract," he said. "Real estate. Dated 3 weeks ago. A cash offer on your former house in Ravenswood." Teresa sat very still. "Wait," she said. "The house was never listed." "I know," Michael replied. "That's the thing. Rachel signed an agreement with a private investment group, all done off market." Teresa's jaw clenched. "But it's not hers to sell." "No," he said, "it's not." There was a pause. She used the power of attorney. The world didn't shift. It didn't tilt or twist. It calcified, solidified around her like resin, the kind you pour over something fragile when you know it's about to break. "And the buyer?" she asked. "A shell LLC. Common tactic. But it traces back to a holding firm tied to her husband's company. It's clever, just not clever enough." Teresa exhaled through her nose. "She never even mentioned it." "Of course not," Michael said. "Because she doesn't see you anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said carefully, "Rachel doesn't see you as Teresa. She sees you as a task, a line item, an obstacle." Teresa leaned forward in her chair. Her hands rested calmly on the table, but her eyes were volcanic. "She stole from me." "Yes, she stole memory. That house." Her voice cracked for the first time. "That house is where Robert taught her to ride a bike, where we painted the walls ourselves, where I bled for her future. She's not just selling walls and windows, Michael. She's selling my life." He didn't interrupt. "I want to stop this," she said. "Legally, quietly. But I don't want to confront her, not yet." "Then what do you want to do?" She didn't answer right away. She stared out the window at the edge of night slicing across the city. Then she turned to him with the calm of a general planning her last campaign. "I want to show her who she's really dealing with." Michael blinked. "Okay, how?" "I want a party." He furrowed his brow. "Not a confrontation, not a lecture. A party," she repeated. "Intimate, elegant, like I used to throw. But this time," she smiled. It was not a sweet smile. "This time I want cameras. I want witnesses. And I want it to be the last thing she ever expects from me." Michael exhaled a low breath. Then he opened his briefcase again. "Well," he said, "let's give her a night she'll never forget." And Teresa nodded. Because she wasn't angry anymore. She was ready. The old Ravenswood house looked smaller than Teresa remembered. Memory had a way of widening walls, stretching staircases, romanticizing rot. But now, standing at the curb in her wheelchair, she could see it clearly for what it was, a narrow red brick 2-story nestled between a maple tree that always dropped too early and a neighbor who never trimmed their hedge. But it was hers, not in paperwork anymore, at least, not until Michael finished untangling the lies, but in essence, in oxygen, in everything that had stitched her together when the world tried to unravel her. Maria had driven her there hesitant but obedient. Teresa told her it was just for a few minutes, a sentimental detour. She didn't tell her that the key hidden under the chipped flower pot on the porch still worked, or that her hands still remembered the weight of that doorknob like it was a part of her body. The door creaked open like it remembered her too. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and time. No one lived there now, not since the renters moved out last fall. but it hadn't gone stale. The sunlight fell through the west-facing windows onto the hardwood floor, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts. She moved slowly, each wheel of her chair whispering across the familiar grain of the living room floor. Her hand reached out instinctively, brushing the edge of the staircase rail, the one Robert had installed himself, after declaring the original one too flimsy to support life. Her fingers stopped at a chip in the wood halfway up the stairs. She remembered Rachel, 8 years old, tumbling down 3 steps and crying for 30 minutes straight, not from pain, but humiliation. Teresa had sat beside her the whole time, holding an ice pack to her elbow, pretending not to laugh. She made her way into the dining room where the bay window once overlooked Robert's rose garden. It was dead now, just dirt and the outline of old roots. She stared through the glass, imagining the ghost of her husband still in the yard, yelling at squirrels like they were burglars. And then she saw it. Hanging crooked on the wall just left of the archway into the kitchen was the one thing she hadn't been sure she'd find. Rachel's painting. She'd painted it at age 10. Watercolor on thick paper, unevenly framed in a cheap wood border. It wasn't good, at least not in any technical sense. Teresa's eyes were lopsided. The colors bled where Rachel had used too much water. Her hair looked like it was on fire. But it was hers, the only portrait anyone had ever painted of her. Rachel had burst into the studio that Saturday morning, holding it in both hands, cheeks flushed with pride. "It's you, Mommy," she'd said. "It's you how I see you." And Teresa, who had just finished drafting a pattern for the Milano Spring Show, stopped everything. She set her pencil down, turned off the radio, and held that painting like it was a love letter from God. She'd cried, not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. She kept it, framed it, hung it in the house, and never moved it. Even when Robert died, even when Rachel moved away, even when the renters tried to redecorate, Teresa left one rule that painting stays where it is. She stared at it now, 32 years later. Then, without ceremony, she reached up, undid the hanging wire, and pulled it down. Her fingers ran across the warped edge of the frame, tracing the little RL initials Rachel had carved into the corner. The last time she'd seen Rachel show that kind of heart was, she couldn't remember. She carried the painting to the hallway closet. Inside was the locked cedar chest Robert had built when Rachel was born. A time capsule, he called it, for the things we can't ever afford to forget. She pulled the key from around her neck, thin silver, always warm from her skin, and unlocked the chest. Inside were Robert's cufflinks, her mother's rosary, a concert program from their first date, and now carefully, reverently, Teresa laid the painting inside. She sat back and stared at the open chest, at everything they had once been, everything they had protected. And then her eyes settled on the single photograph, taped to the lid, yellowed, curling, still clinging. It was the 3 of them, on the front porch, Robert's arm around Teresa, Rachel between them, covered in sidewalk chalk and summer sweat, holding an orange popsicle in one hand and her mother's scarf in the other. The day had been hot, sticky. Rachel was supposed to nap but hadn't. Robert had just finished mowing the lawn. Teresa remembered being annoyed about something she couldn't even name. But in the picture they were all smiling like it had been the best day of their lives. Teresa shut the chest. Not with anger, not with mourning, but with finality. These were things Rachel could never understand. Never would. Because somewhere between the sidewalk chalk and the email signatures she had forgotten who they were. Teresa wheeled back into the center of the room, looked around, touched the wall where Robert had measured Rachel's height every 6 months. The marks were faint now, faded under paint but not gone. She took out her phone and snapped a picture, just in case. Then she whispered to no one in particular, "It's not just a house." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "It's a story, and no one gets to erase me from the ending." She paused, and then, not even my own daughter. She turned the chair around and rolled toward the front door. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like a queen exiting her childhood throne room for the last time. She didn't look back. Back in the car, Maria asked gently, "Everything okay, Miss Lane?" Teresa nodded. "I'm just remembering what needs protecting." As the car pulled away, she didn't watch the house shrink in the rear view. She was too busy thinking about the invitation list, about lighting, about cameras. because now finally her decision was made. Rachel hadn't just tried to sell a building. She tried to sell the proof that love had ever lived there. And Teresa Lane wasn't done reminding the world that love, real love, doesn't go quietly. Not when it's been painted, sealed, and stored beneath a silver key worn close to the skin. By the following Monday, Teresa Lane had a checklist. Not a grocery list, not a medication schedule, a plan. A blueprint only. Instead of drafting a runway collection, she was designing a moment to be remembered, retold, and regretted, if not by her, then by someone else. This was not going to be a scene, it was going to be a statement. Her first call wasn't to a florist or a caterer. It was to a discreet production house she'd once hired decades ago when she needed backstage footage from one of her early fashion shows. The company Black Anchor Visuals had a reputation for being invisible camera operators who blended into the walls but caught everything, including moments people wished had stayed private. The voice on the other end of the line recognized her immediately. "Ms. Lane," the woman said, respectful but surprised. "We thought you retired from everything." "I thought so too," Teresa replied, "until recently. I need a 4-person crew, hidden mics, roving cams, full coverage of a private dinner. Personal event. Very," she said. "But let's call it documentary style with a generous tip if no one breathes a word." The woman chuckled softly. "You haven't changed a bit." Teresa smiled grimly. "Oh, I've changed. That's the point." Her next stop, her attorney. Michael Heller met her at First Prairie Bank on East Delaware the following afternoon. The building's glass facade reflected her wheelchair as they entered, giving her a fractured silhouette she didn't care for. The lobby was cool and sterile, lit like a confession booth. At the front desk, a young man with a perfect tie and vacant eyes asked if they had an appointment. "We don't," Michael said, "but Miss Lane owns 4 accounts and a sizable investment portfolio here, so I think we'll be seen." Within minutes, they were escorted to a private office overlooking the city's skyline. The banker assigned to her, a thin man with 2 white teeth named Evan, extended his hand without meeting Teresa's eyes. "Miss Lane," he said, "a pleasure." "Let's skip the pleasantries," she said, maneuvering her chair beside the desk. "I'm here to sever certain access permissions tied to my accounts, effective immediately." Evan blinked. I see. Are we referring to the joint power of attorney currently held by Rachel Landon?" Michael answered before she could. "We're referring to revoking that power. She no longer holds the principal's confidence." Teresa placed a file folder on the desk. Inside were signed papers witnessed and dated. Additionally, she said, "I want all financial activity monitored. If anyone besides me attempts to move $1, I want you to call Michael, not me." Evan hesitated. "There will be a process, of course, internal reviews, compliance." "I'm 74, she said coolly. "If this process takes longer than 48 hours, someone's losing a client with a 7-figure balance." He smiled nervously, nodding, understood. They shook hands. Evan's grip was soft. On the way out, Michael whispered, "You really do miss the runway, don't you?" "Only the part where I got to shut down idiots with a look." Back at her apartment, the planning began. It wasn't just a dinner. It would be a gallery of memories wrapped in linen and candlelight. If Rachel was going to sell her past, Teresa would make her look it in the face first. She called Madame Lise a private chef with a reputation for opulence and temperamental genius. Teresa had known her since Paris, where they once collaborated on a fashion show that served foie gras instead of champagne. "This will be 6 courses, Teresa instructed. French-inspired, no foam, no nonsense. Everything plated like a love letter." "Theme?" Madame Lise asked. "Closure." The woman paused, bit vague. Teresa smiled into the phone. "Good. It's supposed to be." Next, she called Vincent Bloom, a florist who specialized in emotional architecture. She ordered 40 calla lilies, 6 arrangements of forget-me-nots, and 1 cascading centerpiece of hydrangea and black tulips. He asked what the occasion was. "An ending," she said, "but I want it to look like a beginning." Her final call was to Rachel. She waited until sunset, until the light outside her window turned to amber. Teresa wanted her voice to carry something warm, something ancient like the golden hour before darkness. Rachel picked up on the second ring. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, darling. I'm hosting a small dinner next Friday, just family, and a few long-time connections. I'd like you to come." Rachel sounded surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Oh, yes," Teresa said lightly. I just thought it was time we closed one chapter properly. You know, say goodbye to a version of life that no longer fits. Rachel paused. That's vague. I'm old. I'm allowed to be cryptic. You'll come. Rachel hesitated. Then sure. I mean, of course. David and I can both make it. Wonderful. Dress nicely. I'm having everything filmed for the memories. Another pause. You're filming a dinner. I'm documenting my transition. Just a personal project. You don't have to speak on camera unless you feel moved to. Rachel made a polite sound, something between a chuckle and a sigh. Okay, Mom. Whatever you say. Good. See you then. Teresa hung up. She stared out the window for a moment, her reflection faint in the glass. This wasn't just a dinner. It was theater, and she was both playwright and executioner. In the following days, her apartment transformed. The dining table was extended by 2 leaves. White linens were pressed. Crystal stemware borrowed from an old neighbor arrived with a handwritten note. Glad to see you entertaining again. The city missed your taste. She curated a playlist of music from her studio years, Coltrane, Brel, Edith Piaf, and the soft instrumental pieces Robert used to play while sketching furniture designs on Sunday afternoons. Each seat at the table bore a place card with names handwritten in ink. Rachel, David, Emma, Michael, Madame Lise, Vincent, and 2 former assistants from her design house she hadn't seen in 15 years. She printed menus, designed in Art Deco fonts with gold leaf accents. Under the title it read, Une soirée pour terminer, a night to end things properly. Maria, her caregiver, watched this orchestration unfold with increasing confusion. You're really doing all this yourself? She asked one morning as Teresa dictated email invites. Darling, Teresa said without looking up, I once organized a show in Milan using only duct tape and 4 interns with fevers. This is a cakewalk. You sure your daughter won't suspect something? Teresa's smile was tight. She won't. She's too busy being the star of her own movie. She won't realize I've changed the script until the credits roll. By Thursday evening, the apartment looked like a magazine spread. Candlelight tucked into glass globes. Floral arrangements positioned to maximize shadow and scent the scent of truffle oil already steeping into the walls. She called Michael one last time. You're sure the accounts are locked? Everything's frozen. And Rachel's been notified, though not by me. She'll learn the hard way. And the paperwork, waiting in a folder on your bookshelf. Good, Teresa said. Now all that's left is dinner, he finished. No, Teresa replied. All that's left is truth, served with a side of filet mignon and just enough wine to make the lies crack open. She hung up, and as the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, Teresa Lane sat in the middle of her candle-lit apartment, composed calm and ready to dine on the silence she had waited far too long to break. At precisely 8:04 p.m., the soufflé was served. Flawless golden, gently rising in ramekins that shimmered under candlelight. The scent of vanilla and brown sugar folded into the room, and for a moment everything looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine called Gracefully Aging. Then Teresa Lane touched her fork to her glass again. The room hushed again, and this time she didn't smile. Instead, she reached to her right where Maria, hovering by the credenza, held a small black remote. Teresa pressed the button. The string lights dimmed. The music faded. One of the floral arrangements, an oversized bouquet of lilies and tulips, pivoted ever so slightly to reveal a drop-down projector screen mounted discreetly on the far wall. Gasps, one audible "what the hell" from Vincent. Rachel turned in her chair. Mom, what are you doing? Teresa didn't answer. The screen lit up with a blue flicker, then static, then clarity. A video began to play silent at first, then with soft audio feeding through the room's ceiling speakers. A date stamp in the corner read 12 weeks ago. The footage showed a quiet office. A man in a navy suit, Evan the banker, sat at his desk. Across from him, Rachel, hair in a loose chignon, glasses perched for effect, her voice calm, confident. Yes, she was saying, we've decided to move her into assisted care. She doesn't need the house anymore. Frankly, the stairs are dangerous, and it's time. Evan looked hesitant. She hasn't said anything about selling. She's fragile, Rachel replied. She forgets what day it is. She doesn't always understand paperwork anymore. Teresa could feel the oxygen change in the room. The video continued. Rachel pulled out a folder. inside a stack of documents, including the power of attorney. She handed it to Evan. He skimmed it. "Is this the most updated version?" Rachel smiled. "It's the only one that matters." Then without pause, she reached across the desk and signed a name. Teresa Lane, the same way she had for years. Flowing script, looped L, quiet fraud. The footage paused on the signature. The screen held still. Silence devoured the room. David set down his fork. Rachel's face had gone white. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Teresa finally spoke. Her voice was calm, low, controlled like a loaded trigger. "I hadn't planned on showing that," she said. "Not publicly, not tonight. But sometimes the truth insists on being seen." She gestured toward the screen, which now displayed a title slide documented evidence. March through May. 3 months ago, my daughter decided she would help herself to something that didn't belong to her. Not jewelry, not heirlooms, not keepsakes. My life, my home, my rights. Signed away with a pen and a lie. Vincent leaned forward. "That was real." Michael nodded, slow and grim, very. Rachel finally found her voice. "Mother, this is completely out of context." Teresa raised a hand, just once, enough to silence her. "No, there is no context in which forgery becomes mercy. There's no angle from which betrayal looks like protection." Rachel looked around the table, realizing no one would save her, not even David, who had now sunk slightly in his chair, staring down at his plate like it held all the answers he didn't want to face. "I was trying to help you," Rachel said, rising from her seat. "You're not well. You've had strokes. You forget things." Teresa didn't blink. "I forget birthdays, not betrayal." "You're not thinking clearly." "No," Teresa said, folding her hands neatly. "I'm thinking exactly clearly. I see now who you are, and who I will never be to you again." The air cracked, like glass spidering under pressure. "I'm your daughter," Rachel cried. "You were," Teresa replied. "And then you made me your burden. And now you're just a woman who tried to sell my life without asking." Michael stood up slowly, holding a leather folder. "In accordance with Miss Lane's wishes, I have here a revised and notarized last will and testament dated 2 weeks ago." Rachel's eyes widened. Mom, you can't be serious," Michael continued. "The new beneficiary of Ms. Lane's estate, valued currently at $1.6 million in assets, including the Ravenswood property and securities, will be the Chicago Foundation for Disabled Artists and Creatives." Vincent gasped. "Teresa, that's..." She nodded. "They helped me after my fall, when I couldn't even hold a pencil with my dominant hand. When Rachel was too busy sending emails and too proud to push a wheelchair," Michael went on. "There will be a dedicated scholarship fund for emerging artists with mobility impairment, named after Teresa's late husband, Robert Lane, and a $200,000 trust set aside for Emma Landon should she ever choose to pursue creative education. Rachel Landon receives nothing." Rachel's face blanched. "You're cutting me out." "I'm freeing you," Teresa said softly, "from the exhausting responsibility of pretending you love me." Rachel's voice dropped. "You're out of your mind." Teresa leaned forward slightly. Her eyes gleamed not with anger but clarity. "I'm not out of my mind, Rachel. I'm finally in it. For the first time since the stroke, I've remembered who I am. I'm not your deadweight. I'm not your justification. I'm not your signature to steal." Rachel's hands trembled. "You can't do this." "I just did." She turned to Maria. "Please serve the digestive." Rachel slammed her hand against the table. "This is insane. You're humiliating me in front of everyone." Teresa exhaled. "No, Rachel. You humiliated yourself. I simply provided the lighting." The cameras caught it all. And for the first time in years, Teresa Lane felt weightless. Not because she'd destroyed her daughter, but because she'd finally chosen to stop letting someone else rewrite her ending. The projector shut off. The screen rolled back up. The last bite of soufflé sat untouched, and Teresa raised her glass not in toast but in triumph. The lawsuit arrived 3 days later. It came in a manila envelope, unceremoniously dropped into Teresa Lane's mailbox by a courier who didn't know or care that the woman receiving it had once dressed the First Lady of France. It was thick, stapled, and aggressively typed. Teresa unfolded each page like she was peeling skin. Petition for guardianship. Due to incapacity. Petitioner Rachel Landon. Respondent. Teresa Lane. She didn't need to finish reading to know the rest. Rachel had filed to have her declared mentally incompetent, unfit to manage her own finances, unfit to live alone, unfit to make legal decisions. A woman who once crafted entire careers with her fingertips, reduced to a signature and a psychiatric form. Maria found her at the kitchen table, not crying, not fuming, just staring at the final page with a look that belonged more in a courtroom than a breakfast nook. "She's suing you, Maria?" asked carefully. Teresa tilted her head slightly. "She's trying to rewrite the ending again." That night, Teresa called Michael. "She wants a war," she said. "Then I'll give her a war." But what Teresa did next was not rage, not retaliation. It was something colder, smarter. The same strategy she once used to take over a failing design house at age 35 and rebuild it from the fabric up. She agreed to every test, cognitive, neurological, psychiatric, even a full physical, not to prove herself to Rachel, but to remind the world that clarity doesn't always come in youth. The tests were scheduled within the week. Teresa arrived at the clinic in a dark navy coat, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun that Robert used to say made her look like she was preparing for battle. The first test was conducted by Dr. Samuel Clark, a neurologist with a reputation for being thorough to the point of tedious. He opened with a clipboard and no eye contact. "Ms. Lane, I'll be asking a series of memory-based questions, dates, names, logic. Do I get extra credit if I quote Simone de Beauvoir halfway through?" He blinked. "Excuse me?" Teresa smiled, slow and deliberate. "Never mind, let's begin." She answered every question with calm precision, named all 50 states, identified abstract patterns in geometric shapes, recalled world events by decade. When asked to spell encyclopedia backwards, she didn't pause once. At one point, the assistant asked her to describe her typical day. Wake up, regret being 74 for approximately 6 minutes. Drink chamomile tea. Review stock performance. Fire imaginary bullets at my daughter's lawyer with my eyes. Try to forgive myself for raising someone who values real estate more than memory. Then sketch out ideas for an art program I'm developing for disabled students. Silence. Dr. Clark finally lowered his clipboard. "I think we're done here." The psychological assessment was worse, but not because Teresa failed, because she didn't. The psychiatrist, a woman named Dr. Eliza Kohler, leaned forward after the session and said, "Ms. Lane, it is my professional opinion that not only are you fully competent, but you're processing betrayal with more grace than most 30-year-olds I've treated." Teresa offered a thin smile. "That's because I've had practice." "Still," Dr. Kohler said gently, "I have to ask, why not press criminal charges? She forged your signature, lied to a financial institution." Teresa stared out the window. "Because the punishment I've already delivered hurts more." By the end of the week, the media had caught on. It started with a local digital outlet, Chicago Now, then the Tribune, then a small viral clip uploaded anonymously the moment at the dinner party when the projector played, and Rachel's expression collapsed in real time. The internet had a new headline: "Mother outs daughter's betrayal at dinner party, uses video evidence, leaves nothing in will." The comments were brutal. "She's a queen. The daughter needs jail and therapy. I aspire to this level of revenge. Elder abuse is real, and she fought back with art." By Sunday, Teresa Lane was the subject of a trending hashtag, Dinner with Teresa. Michael called to warn her the news might get worse before it got better. "I'm fine," she said. "Let them talk. I've been invisible long enough." She shut off her phone, rolled into the corner of her apartment where the old cedar chest now sat open, reached inside, and this time she didn't pull out a memory. She pulled out her paint set. The brushes were stiff, the watercolors dried to cracked cakes, but the box still smelled faintly of almond oil and old linen. She hadn't painted since the fall, since her right hand failed her and the world tilted. But she was still here. She placed the set on the table, unclasped the lid, picked up the smallest brush with her left hand. The first line was a disaster, shaky, uncertain, more ghost than mark. The second wasn't much better. But by the fifth stroke, her fingers found rhythm. Her shoulder moved with memory, not of the body, but of the spirit. She wasn't painting for a gallery. She wasn't painting for redemption. She was painting to remind herself the hand may falter, but the will does not. The next day she painted again, and the next, and the next. On the fourth day she painted Rachel. Not as she was, but as she used to be. Age 10, hair wild, eyes unburdened, holding a popsicle and a paintbrush in the same hand. She titled the piece The Girl Who Forgot the Colors, and then began the next, The Woman Who Remembered. The fifth painting was the one that broke her, not from frustration or failure, but from truth. Truth has a strange way of appearing not in words, not even in memories, but in brushstrokes. Teresa Lane had been painting every morning at the same table, always in silence, always with her left hand. The hand that was never meant to lead. The hand that had been quiet most of her life, obedient secondary. Until now. She had started calling it her new right hand, not out loud, just privately, in that sacred space between breath and belief. That morning the canvas held a silhouette. No face, no eyes. Just the outline of a woman sitting in a chair by a window, her spine slightly curved, her hands outstretched, not reaching, not resisting, simply open. It was the first painting she didn't plan. It simply emerged. Like her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. When she stepped back to look at it, she didn't see a chair. She saw a throne. She titled it The Body Remembers. And she cried not because of what was on the canvas, but because of what it wasn't. It wasn't Rachel. It wasn't Robert. It wasn't grief. It was her. Her. Just her. And that for the first time in months felt like enough. Later that week she boxed up 3 of the paintings carefully, with linen between each canvas, and mailed them to the Chicago Center for Disabled Artists, the very foundation she'd endowed through her will. She included a short note handwritten, "If art can be made from a broken hand, maybe healing can come from a broken home." Teresa Lane. She expected nothing in return, no applause, no polite thank you. That was the thing about art, you didn't create it to be seen. You created it to see yourself. But something else happened. It came on a Sunday afternoon in the form of a knock. Not Maria, not the mailman, not Michael. Emma, Rachel's daughter, 18. Thin, tired around the eyes in that way only children of ambitious parents get. She stood on the landing holding a small backpack, wearing an oversized sweatshirt, and the kind of look Teresa recognized immediately, shame wrapped in confusion. Teresa opened the door without a word. Emma stepped in slowly, eyes brimming. "I'm sorry to show up like this," she said, voice barely holding together. "I didn't know where else to go." Teresa motioned toward the kitchen table, now transformed into a makeshift art studio, jars of brushes, smudged palettes, stacks of canvases drying by the window. Emma didn't sit. She stood there, fists clenched at her sides. "I saw the video. The one from the dinner," she said. "Everyone at school's been talking about it. I didn't know. I mean, I knew Mom could be cold sometimes, but I didn't think..." Her voice cracked. "I didn't think she'd do that to you." Teresa didn't blink. Most people only show their shadows when they think the lights are off. Emma swallowed hard. "She told me you were slipping, that you didn't know what you were doing anymore. But when I saw you at the party, you weren't slipping. You were sharper than anyone in the room." Teresa said nothing. Emma sat down finally. Her knees trembled. "I want to learn," she whispered, "to paint or draw or something." Teresa tilted her head. "Why?" Emma hesitated. "Because I don't want to forget things, like she did." Teresa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Painting doesn't stop memory from fading, sweetheart. It just reminds you what was worth remembering." Emma looked at the canvas Teresa had just finished. Her eyes lingered on the faceless woman in the chair. "Is that you?" Teresa nodded. "That's the version of me I didn't know I needed to meet." Emma's voice broke into a whisper. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Teresa reached for an empty canvas, slid it across the table. Then she handed Emma the smallest brush she owned, the one Rachel had used as a child, the same brush she'd once found dipped in grape juice and used to ruin an entire silk dress. Emma took it with both hands, held it like something sacred. Teresa smiled. "If you paint with your hands," she said, "you'll make something nice. But if you paint with your heart..." She paused, locking eyes with the girl. "You'll never paint like your mother." Emma choked out a laugh, then wiped her face with her sleeve. And just like that, the next generation had entered. Not with fanfare, but with humility and a brush. That evening they painted side by side, not in silence, but in rhythm. Teresa guided her with softness, not instruction. "Let the brush find the line," she said once. "Don't push it. Listen." Emma's first stroke was hesitant but not fearful. Her second was bold. By the third, she was already choosing colors Teresa had never dared to mix. Teresa watched with something deeper than pride. It wasn't the thrill of legacy. It was the awe of unexpected alignment, two spirits from the same bloodline finally facing the canvas with honesty. When Maria arrived later, she stopped at the doorway stunned. "You're not just teaching her to paint," she whispered to Teresa. "No," Teresa replied, her voice low and certain. "I'm teaching her to see." And in that moment, Teresa Lane knew something with absolute clarity. Her daughter had broken the line, but her granddaughter would redraw it. With new colors, and with both hands. The headlines changed tone. What once read like a dark family drama now took on the sharp edges of a scandal. Daughter accused of financial exploitation. After mother's viral dinner revelation, bank freezes accounts, pending forgery investigation against Rachel Landon. The art of revenge, or the justice of reinvention. Rachel's voice was no longer heard in boardrooms or brunches. Her calls went unanswered. Her firm, once proud to show her face on brochures as Legacy realized, quietly scrubbed her photo from their website. Her clients dropped one by one. There had been no charges yet, but the freeze was real. Investigators were digging, and the whispers were louder than her PR firm could manage. Back in the penthouse apartment she hadn't visited in weeks, Teresa Lane exhaled slowly as Michael read aloud the latest developments. Rachel's accounts frozen, her power of attorney revoked, access to Teresa's portfolio blocked, control gone, just silence and consequence. It was Emma who brought the invitation. A local talk show, Real Lives, Real Courage, wanted Teresa to appear on their next televised roundtable, Redefining Family in the Age of Control. At first, Teresa hesitated. She had never liked spotlights that didn't involve fabric or color palettes. But Emma looked her in the eye and said people need to see what strength looks like at 74. And something in Teresa softened, not from flattery, from recognition. The girl was no longer asking to be taught. She was inviting Teresa to be seen. The studio was smaller than Teresa expected. Warm lighting, friendly producers. But Teresa insisted on one thing: no stage makeup. She wanted to appear as she was: wrinkles, wisdom, and wheelchair. When the segment aired live on a Sunday evening, the country leaned in. The host opened with a familiar question. "Ms. Lane, a lot of people are calling what you did at that dinner table a masterclass in vengeance. Was that your intention?" Teresa smiled, then tilted her head with that signature arch of her brow. "If I'd wanted vengeance, I'd have sold her house. But no, that wasn't vengeance. That was me turning around finally and facing the woman I had ignored for too long myself." Applause. The host leaned forward. "So you're saying you turned your back on your daughter?" Teresa paused, then said clearly, "No, I didn't turn my back on Rachel. I turned toward myself, and in doing so, I saw clearly for the first time in years what love is supposed to look like. It's not obedience, it's not transaction, it's not silence in the face of betrayal. It's truth, and truth hurts, but it heals too." Clips of that segment went viral. The moment she said, "I didn't disown my daughter, I reowned myself." That quote landed on posters, essays, podcasts. Teresa Lane had become something she never expected in the winter of her life, a movement. And from that movement came a miracle. The first free art class was held in the community hall 3 blocks from her apartment. The city had offered a bigger space. She declined. "I want them to see each other, not just me." 6 students showed up the first day, 4 in wheelchairs, 2 with prosthetic arms. One young man who didn't speak, but painted in aggressive reds and blacks that made Emma flinch the first time she saw them. Emma became her assistant, her translator, her second set of eyes, and sometimes her steadying hand. But she wasn't there to help Teresa. She was there to rebuild a line of connection, one brushstroke at a time. Teresa taught more than art. She taught defiance, through color, through shape, through self. She told her students, If the world won't move for you, make it sit still long enough for you to draw it your way. By the third week, the group had a name, Brushes Against Gravity, and by the fourth, a gallery had offered to host their work. But it was the seventh class on a Thursday afternoon lit by spring sun when Teresa unveiled her newest piece. She rolled into the room holding a large canvas veiled in soft cloth. The students gathered around. Emma stood behind her, one hand on the wheelchair. Teresa looked up. This, she said, is not a portrait. It's not a memory. It's not even revenge. She pulled the cloth back, and there she was, on canvas. Not younger, not idealized, but whole. Wrinkles, bent spine, messy hair, laugh lines that reached past the cheek. One hand held a paintbrush, the other rested gently on her lap. But the eyes were on fire. She'd titled it, The Old Woman No Longer Old. The room was silent. Then the young man who never spoke reached up, touched the edge of the canvas, and signed in air. Thank you. Teresa nodded. For the first time she felt not just alive, she felt immortal, not because she'd outlived betrayal, but because she had redefined what living even meant. It arrived on a Tuesday. No courier this time, no legal stamps, no envelope reeking of power or consequence. Just a plain cream-colored envelope postmarked local, slipped gently beneath Teresa Lane's apartment door, like a whisper. Maria found it first while sweeping, thinking it was another flyer. But when she placed it on the kitchen table, Teresa paused. The handwriting, it wasn't Emma's. It wasn't a stranger's. It was Rachel's. The same script that had once signed handmade birthday cards with "To the best mom in the universe." The same looped R's and slanted L's that had labeled science projects and apology notes in 7th grade. But this one bore no decoration. Just her name. Mom. Teresa stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. Not because she was afraid of what it might say, but because part of her feared what she might feel. When she finally unsealed it, her hands were steady. Inside was a single folded page. No typed lines, no excuses, just pen and paper. Mom. There's no good way to start this. I've rewritten this first line 23 times, but it doesn't get easier. So here it is. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you by handling things behind your back. But if I'm being honest, I wasn't doing it for you, I was doing it for me. For my image, for my comfort, for control. And when you pulled the rug out from under me at that dinner, I hated you. But now I think I hated myself more. Watching the news clips, hearing what you said, hearing how clearly and calmly you called out the truth, it broke something open in me, something that needed to break. I don't deserve your forgiveness, I know that. I just wanted to ask for something small. May I come to one of your classes? I won't speak. I won't interrupt. I just want to sit in the back, watch, learn. I want to remember how to see again. Love, Rachel. Teresa reread it twice, then once more. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply folded the letter back along its crease and set it on the table right next to her paints. An hour later, she pulled out a blank card. Not a birthday card. Not even a thank you note. Just white paper, clean, ready. She wrote a single sentence. If you want to learn how to draw Rachel, you must start from gratitude. She didn't sign it. Didn't need to. She mailed it the next morning. Not out of obligation. Out of clarity. 2 weeks later, Rachel appeared at the art class. Not in designer heels or a sleek blazer. She wore jeans, an oversized hoodie, and the same nervous eyes her daughter had brought with her weeks before. She entered through the side door and didn't speak to anyone. She didn't even make eye contact with Teresa. She sat in the far back corner. No canvas, no brush, just a notebook. Teresa glanced up briefly, said nothing, but her shoulders softened by half an inch. Rachel watched for the entire 90 minutes as Teresa guided the class through an exercise in portrait abstraction. Draw not what you see, but what you remember about the shape of a person's spirit. Emma stood beside Teresa, assisting as usual. Her strokes were confident now, and her voice when she offered help to a young girl with cerebral palsy was calm and kind. At the end of the session, as the students packed up their materials, Rachel stood just for a moment and offered a silent nod in Teresa's direction. It was not returned, but neither was it rejected. The next day, a package arrived at Teresa's apartment. Not from Rachel, from the city's Youth Art Foundation. Inside a certificate. Emma had won honorable mention in a local art competition for her piece titled "The Woman Who Turned Backward to Move Forward." The The judges praised its symbolism, its fierce color work, and the complexity of portraying both age and rebirth in a single portrait. The portrait, of course, was of Teresa, done in charcoal and watercolor, left hand only. When Emma brought the certificate and the original painting to class the next week, Teresa said nothing, just stared. Then she took the painting home. That evening, as the sun set through her wide windows, Teresa unpinned the last birthday card she had ever received. The printed one, the one that had come months ago, cold and corporate from her daughter's hand, and replaced it with Emma's painting, right on the door to her room. A new ritual, a new recognition, and perhaps in some invisible, unspoken way, a new beginning. The morning of her 75th birthday began like any other day. No champagne, no orchestras, no glittering calls from journalists wanting to feature her in profiles in aging gracefully. Just light soft and warm cascading through the wide windows of her apartment. The kind of golden morning light that doesn't ask for applause. It just enters gentle and persistent, like memory. Teresa Lane rolled her wheelchair over to the window, her left hand holding a mug of black coffee, lukewarm, bitter, honest. Just the way she liked it. There were no vases of lilies crowding her table, no couriers rushing in with flower arrangements from people who barely remembered her birthday but wanted to post about it. She had asked for none of it. This year there were only 2 things she allowed herself: a full day without interruptions, and 1 envelope. It had arrived the night before, hand-delivered, not mailed. Emma had slipped it under the door quietly, not wanting to make a spectacle of it. Teresa had known. She had seen the shadow pause by the crack under the door and the slight sound of paper brushing tile. But she hadn't picked it up, not yet. Instead, she let it wait, because not every gift is meant to be opened right away. Some gifts require space and stillness and breath. Now, with the light soaking the room in truth and dust, she bent forward, slow, careful, and picked up the envelope. It was pale blue, hand-drawn flowers along the border, the kind of delicate inkwork that takes time, patience, and an absence of ego. No name written on the outside, just a tiny sketch of a paintbrush, its bristles dipped in what looked like a heart. Teresa opened it. Inside was a folded card, also handmade. On the front, in carefully brushed watercolor, was a simple scene: a woman in a wheelchair painting a garden. The garden was incomplete. Only the left side was fully blooming, but the brush in the woman's hand was mid-stroke, as if she were still planting color with every movement. Above it, the words, "To the woman who repainted her life with her heart." Teresa's chest lifted, then sank again. She exhaled slowly. The ink was still faintly scented with orange blossoms, Emma's favorite. She turned the card over and froze. There, carefully taped to the back, was a faded piece of paper, an old drawing yellowed at the edges. She recognized it instantly. It was Rachel's, the first portrait Rachel had ever drawn of her, crude in crayon. Teresa's hair had been exaggeratedly tall, and her smile stretched far too wide across her cheeks. But the detail was unmistakable. She'd drawn Teresa holding Rachel's hand, the 2 of them standing next to a sign that said, "Mom's Studio, no boys allowed." Teresa laughed. It came out unexpectedly bright, cracked, completely human. A laugh that sounded like a drawer opening after years of being stuck. A sound that was part joy, part grief, part release. She held the card to her chest, shut her eyes, and let the moment wash over her. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't reconciliation. This was evolution. She wheeled herself over to the corkboard by her door. It was cluttered with drawings now, Emma's winning portrait notes from students, scraps of color palettes she wanted to experiment with. Right in the center, she pinned the card. Above everything else, no birthday gift could compete with this. No bouquet could bloom as fiercely. That afternoon, Emma arrived quietly. She didn't bring cake, just an easel and a fresh canvas. "I thought we'd paint something together today," she said. Teresa nodded. "What are we painting?" Emma smiled. "Nothing." They spent 2 hours doing just that, staring at the blank canvas, sipping tea, telling stories in brushstrokes instead of words. It was the first time Teresa didn't try to make something beautiful. She just made something true. By sunset, the canvas was covered in color. No shape, no figures. Just layers of soft orange burnt sienna, streaks of blue. The piece had no name. They didn't sign it. It simply existed, a painting made of presence. That night, Teresa sat by her window again, looking out at the skyline. Chicago had changed. So had she. The woman once known for designing interiors for the city's most elite had somehow become a symbol of inner reinvention. Her story had traveled further than she ever intended. She'd been invited to keynote conferences, write a memoir, star in a documentary. She'd said no to most of it. Fame was never her brush. Truth was. And today the truth was this. She had received many birthday cards in her life, some glittering with hollow compliments, some loaded with guilt, some printed cold and sharp like knives in pastel envelopes. But this one, this hand-drawn, heart-dipped card had done what no other could. It had made her feel reborn, not younger, not more beautiful, just honest. In her voiceover recorded earlier that week for a short documentary being filmed about her class, Teresa's words echoed through the quiet room. A birthday card once shattered me. It didn't say I love you. It said I was a burden. That kind of ink doesn't wash off easily. But sometimes a card can be more than a card. It can be a bridge, a door, a hand held out in silence. I've learned that a piece of paper can kill kindness or resurrect it. And me, I chose resurrection.